Welcome to our departmental seminar for this week. My name is Shelley and I'm delighted to be the host for our seminar session this afternoon. We have the wonderful Professor Sander van der Linden with us today from the University of Cambridge. Sander is a professor in social psychology of society and is director of the social decision making lab at Cambridge. And I would give many accolades. I think one of the biggest is this fantastic book on called Foolproof. And there's more to that title, but I'll go with Foolproof. And I would suggest you have a look at that. You can learn more about Sander's fantastic work on social influence, persuasion, misinformation, and so on. But I'm delighted to have Sander with us today to talk about his research. And first, Sander's going, for the benefit of our ECR colleagues in the room, tell us a little bit about how he got to where he is today, and then we'll move on to his talk.
All right, well, thanks so much for that generous introduction, and pleasure to be here. On the other side, always good to visit Oxford. Yeah, I guess my career's a bit unusual. I never thought I would go into academia, to be honest. I had some other jobs before I went into academia. So I had the benefit of having some real world experience. And then it dawned on me that I really wasn't suited for the real world. And that a 9-to-5 job didn't really vibe with the way that I had envisioned structuring my day. I enjoyed being up at night. I have a odd schedule. I didn't do so well with very hierarchical structures at work, and so I kind of discovered that people do research for a living quite late in the process. I mean, not too late. I mean, I just had a job out of college for a few years. But then I went back to pursue a graduate degree, and I really started to realize that research was something that I wanted to do. I mean, it's funny because at Cambridge and Oxford, people get educated about research very quickly. You know how it works, but certainly my background wasn't at all research driven. So I just kind of discovered the concept of research independently, my parents weren't in academia. They thought like, well, how could you even make a living not having a real job? And so, it was interesting. And so I went back to graduate school, and that's where I really decided that research was something I was passionate about. And I loved modeling. I was doing quantitative work. I loved the nexus between psychology and policy, and so I decided to do a PhD at the LSE in London. And then I transferred to Yale, so I spent some time in the US for a couple of years, and I spent some time at Princeton, and then eventually made the leap back to Cambridge, and I've been at Cambridge now for about 8 years. And I don't know, I feel like when I talk to my students, very open to different career paths. We work with industry, government, research. I always facilitate internships or try to for students. Because I think one of the things I realized is that I've never regretted my choice. I think academia is what I want to do. I like having freedom. I like doing research. I like being independent. So I've never had any doubts as to what my life's passion is. But I think that was only possible because I did something else first quite early on in life and discovered that that was something I don't really want to do. And I had a few different jobs. Actually, I had lots of different jobs when I was in college, after college. And I think that experience really solidified my interest in this, and I still do a lot of consulting. We do, as I'm hoping to show today, a lot of real world applications of the research, and that keeps me interested. But sort of doing the science is my main preoccupation. So I don't know if that's useful, but given we do the same thing at Cambridge, every speaker kind of says a little bit about their own journey. So that was part of my journey. In fact, I was doing like financial engineering models at a bank at some point, and I realized that making other people more money wasn't my life's purpose. And so I just shifted radically into a different interest. Okay, so going into the talk, I'm gonna do a kind of a blitz talk here because I have a lot of content, but I want to leave room for questions. So 2 of these stories are all widely reported. 2 of them are fake. Which one's true? I do this quiz in Cambridge all the time, so now I have the opportunity with the best minds in Oxford to replicate everyone's susceptibility to misinformation. So which of these stories is true? So so raise hand for A, Putin issues international arrest warrant for George Soros. Who thinks that that's true? No? What a confidence in Putin. Yeah, there we go. We've got one brave soul here. B, baby born in California was named Hard Eyes Emoji. Who think that that's true? Okay, a lot of people think that's true. When I give this talk in California, also, most Californians think that okay, so now you're stuck with C though. Criminal farts so loudly, he gives away his own hiding place. He thinks that's true. Okay, also a good amount of people. So we got some good discernment here. It turns out this is true. So criminal was hiding in the bushes and he passed gas so loudly that he gave away his own hiding place. The sheriff's department even tweeted when you're having a hashtag shit day. So yeah, it was a big deal. Okay, but enough with the fart jokes. That's an interesting question because it is difficult to discern. And in fact, how you do this is an interesting question. And Raccoon, who's sitting right here, who spent some years in our lab pioneering some of the research that I'll talk about today also is this sort of notion that how do you measure people's susceptibility to misinformation in terms of a validated psychometric instrument. And I think one of Raccoon's brilliant insights was that there wasn't really a validated scale in this field. And I want to give some examples because I think it's really important to go through the measurements of the issue of like what do you do in this area? How do you measure people's susceptibility to misinformation? It turns out everyone's just using random headlines from the internet. And there's no standardized instrument, and then you get funny things like if everyone's using different measurements and there's no one scale, then how do you know that anything is comparable? Because nothing is really the same in some sense. And so we set out to create this scale, and it's it's not like this, but people do get 20 headlines. Is it 20 we're doing? 20 headlines. There's a short version too. We used AI actually to create the fake headlines. So in this space, it's really interesting, right? Because one of the problems that I have with using real world social media posts early on in this type of research is that what if people know the answer because they know it's true or false because they read it somewhere, they saw it somewhere. So there's a huge memory and familiarity compound here. So we use AI to make sure that nobody's ever seen the headlines before. And then you can have lots of interesting skepticism about the whole idea of creating a test, right? News changes, different cultures, how does this even work? And so actually though, over of this test is actually pretty remarkable in terms of retest reliability. We use different methods, IRT, which is a standard sort of item response theory, but also newer methods like network graph theory, producing slightly different iterations and results of the scale. But overall, it's proven to be a useful instrument. YouGov benchmarked it according to the UK and US population. So hopefully it's been a useful contribution. But I think the big point, the myth is free. Anyone can take it. So if you want to assess your own susceptibility, you get a score in terms of how gullible versus how discerning you are or how distrustful, right? If you say fake to everything, then you have more of a distrust sort of pattern. Whereas if you say true to everything, you're more gullible. And so there's a happy middle. So you kind of get all sorts of responses. And it's an online tool. So it's also an interesting data gathering device. I think we've had hundreds of thousands of people take this test, which allows you to do some big data research on how people in different parts of the country and the world think about this. And then, okay, what's the consequences of people believing in misinformation? Here during the pandemic, we saw people set 5G masts on fire, over 50 of them, because they thought, that somehow the coronavirus was being caused or exacerbated by 5G towers, which is a conspiracy theory, of course. Not just a Western phenomenon. In Iraq, an unusual amount of people were hospitalized because they were ingesting methanol because they read on social media it was going to cure COVID, including children, which can be, quite serious. Of course, we have the Southport attacks here in the UK. And of course, there's an important distinction here that, there's a lot more going on than this misinformation, right? There's anti-immigration sentiment that we're sort of brewing already. But the interesting thing about misinformation when it spreads is that it needs to find a susceptible host, right? Because, misinformation we don't integrate misinformation into our mental model of the world all day long. It only kind of works if you're susceptible to it in the first place. But the story that went viral was, of course, totally fabricated. And the assailant, or the person here that was responsible for the stabbings, supposedly came, by boat last year because he was an asylum seeker. I mean, this was all totally fake. And it provided, of course, the fuel that was needed for group of people who already have problems with immigrants, and so they were duped by the misinformation. Even politicians. I mean, Nigel Farage, was one of the people who was spreading this information, next to other figures like Tommy Robinson. And Nigel Farage admitted that he spread misinformation, but then he blamed it on Tommy Robinson and saying, other people duped me online with this false story. Similar stuff in the US, right? People feed the immigrants are eating cats and dogs. And in fact, there's also a lot of violence. So the Haitians, this was, a lot of fake news coming out of the US that Haitian immigrants were eating pets and dogs, and they received a lot of violent attacks following these rumors online. There's a military convoy heading to Ukraine. In fact, there's a cheap fake. This is Southern California. This went viral on Facebook during the conflict. Great way of Putin claiming that the war in Ukraine was to target Nazis as a pretext for the invasion. The Capitol insurrection in the US, Israel-Hamas conflict, lots of fake imagery. So you have imagery from Arma 3, which is a shooter game. And what's of interest to me, and I'll come back to this in a second, is that a lot of the same techniques are kind of recycled throughout intergroup conflicts that are actually pretty predictable. So for example, here you have a man in the US claiming that the COVID mRNA vaccines will change your DNA. And it's a new vaccine, people have questions and so on. But what interests me as a psychologist is not, I'm not a fact checker, so I don't really care about the specific claims, but what interests me is about the techniques of propaganda. That's what's of interest to me. And if you actually go back to the first vaccine, which was created, the modern vaccine, of course, by Edward Jenner in the 1800s, who used cowpox, right, to inoculate people against smallpox, you actually can find fascinating images from the anti-vax community in the 1800s, who were suggesting that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you would grow udders, and it would start sprouting out of your ears, and you would turn into a human-cow hybrid. Here's an example of that. So here's the udders coming out of your eyes and ears. And the whole idea is that the vaccine is going to change your DNA. Of course, they didn't have the word DNA at the time, but it's going to change your body. And this idea that the vaccine is going to change your body has been around for 200 years. But somehow we're always dealing with this misinformation as if it's a new thing. And actually, a lot of it is predictable. So these Arma 3 images were also used during the Russia-Ukraine conflict to try to portray attacks or violence when it's not actually happening, or trying to misinform people when it is happening. It can be, very destructive. During natural disasters, we have the same in Spain, lots of misinformation in Spain at the moment about where bodies are being buried. So you direct all the police forces to like a shopping mall, and they're looking, and it turns out it was a hoax. And so you're diverting, essential resources away from people who actually need it. So, there's all tons and tons of examples of how misinformation is confusing people. And then people like to ask, okay, what is misinformation? I give this talk once in the philosophy department. I wouldn't recommend doing that again. And so, my definition is it's either false or misleading. But I actually think there's a super important distinction here, because the stuff that's obviously false, like flat Earth and reptile politicians, that's a fraction of what people see in their media sort of diet. But the misleading information, like manipulation, bias, fallacies, is actually a huge portion of a much bigger portion of what's being featured in the media. And I think both are important. So disinformation is misinformation with some psychological intention, like to deceive or harm other people, and propaganda is disinformation in the service of a corporate or political agenda, and doesn't have to be institutionalized, of course. And the term of news is so politicized now that we like to be specific about what type of thing we're talking about. And I'm most concerned, of course, about disinformation and propaganda. And I share the consensus statement for the American Psychological Association, trying to come up with a definition everyone could agree with. We have people from various areas of psychology, and as you can imagine, it was very hard to get everyone to agree on a single definition of misinformation. And so we actually went with the broadest possible sense, that misinformation is any information that's demonstrably false or otherwise misleading, but regardless of source or intention. Because regardless of intention, because in the legal business, it's difficult to prove intent. So there's been disinformation that's well documented, like the tobacco industry's 50-year campaign to hide the health consequence of smoking. That's been very well established because there were documents saying explicitly they were going to manipulate the public about the consequences of smoking. But in other cases, in real time, it's not so easy to do. And source, because sometimes credible sources also spread misinformation, and that's actually much more damaging than some no-name source that people don't recognize. And I'll give you some examples. So in this field, the way people do research is that either they look at some list of fact-check news articles, and that's because We don't want to be arbiters of truth. So psychologists like to defer to fact checkers, right? And you say, like, it was true or false as determined by fact checkers, no PolitiFact, which is fine. There's also people who use the source or the publisher, because there's lists of dodgy publishers. Newsguard, right? They rate every website on the internet, major website, in terms of how unreliable they are, how trustworthy they are based on the editorial standards. That's another heuristic. And these two are fine. On average, right, the BBC is more accurate than Breitbart, right, by quite a bit. But no source is perfect. But it doesn't account for the fact that sometimes influential sources can publish misinformation. The New York Times published tons of misinformation about the war in Iraq, suggesting that there were weapons of mass destruction at the time when there were none. Of course, they apologize for that and set the record straight, which is what good editorial outlets do and what differentiates them from low quality outlets. BBC had the false balance norm of getting people skeptical of climate change on TV all the time until a few years ago. So, even influential outlets can actually produce misleading information. So for that reason, we're focusing on the presence or absence of manipulation techniques. So we're not so interested in the sort of true-false type of research, but we want to calibrate people's judgments as a function of the presence of manipulation more generally. So regardless of veracity, because a lot of misinformation may contain a grain of truth, but is otherwise manipulative, and that's the more subtle, the more impactful stuff. So here's an example, right? So vitamin C protects against coronavirus. That's been fact-checked as false. Health Impact News is also a fake news website. So that's pretty easy. But look at this one. Chicago Tribune, healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. Chicago Tribune is a Pulitzer Prize-winning outlet in the US. And this headline wasn't fact-checked as false, because technically a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine. But of course, what's being used here is a correlation causation fallacy, because the death of the doctor had nothing to do with the vaccine, but it's being framed as if one is the cause of the other, right? And so that's a manipulation technique. It's also clickbait, and for that reason, it's manipulative, even though technically true. And as you can see from analyses, I commented on this for a paper that was published in Science recently, that actually show that if you take all the top stories on Facebook, real behavioral click data, and if you look at the fact-check misinformation on Facebook versus vaccine skeptical content that wasn't explicitly flagged by fact checkers, the impact on vaccination intentions was 50 times less for fact-check misinformation than it was for otherwise dubious information. So the impact of this sort of misleading content is 50 times higher on vaccine intentions than outright misinformation. So that's kind of the broader. And of course, in science, it's not totally unfamiliar territory. Socioeconomic position and the risk of brain tumors, Swedish National Population Cohort Study, sounds good. Then we get the press release, high level of education linked to high brain tumor risk. Still okay. But then we go to the Daily Mail and the Mirror. Why going to university increases risk of getting a brain tumor, right? And so somewhere along the way, things go wrong. And so what we're trying to do is help build resistance to that. So kind of hard pivots to something else now. So this is Madrid. 2.5 million people in Madrid. Madrid's a huge city, tons of people in Madrid. Here's the flag of Spain. You can see how many people are in Madrid. It's the most popular city in Europe. If you didn't know about it, so Madrid is the most popular city in Europe. Here's the growth of Madrid. Again, tons of people. Is there anyone from Madrid here? For Spain? Very good. Okay, so nobody here to fact check me. So if I now say that actually Madrid isn't the most popular city in Europe, that's so bullshit. Some interesting process happens, right? Where we're going to have to tag misinformation in our memory as false. And the main way we've thought about fighting misinformation is through fact checking and debunking. It's now we're going to have to repeat the misinformation and say, oh, remember when I said that Madrid is the most popular city in Europe? Turns out that's not true. It's actually false. Interestingly, it's very difficult for people's memory to deal with that because, as I'm sure many of you know, memory kind of operates like a network, right? So there's links and nodes, and most popular city, Madrid, Spain, everything is linked to each other. And so if you keep repeating the misinformation, the links become stronger. And when you're trying to correct something, people are trying to access the misinformation and the true information at the same time and have to suppress one. And that becomes really difficult to do the more prevalent the misinformation is. If you look at the meta-analyses on fact-checking and debunking, it's useful, but it doesn't undo the damage. I think that's really the key conclusion. There was a recent meta-analysis that actually found a 0 effect on average of debunking misinformation, which is kind of depressing. But there was a lot of heterogeneity, meaning like if you do debunking well, it can work partially. If you don't do it well, it doesn't seem to do much. So there's a sort of huge variation. But in general, it's interesting. So if you look at some of the, fMRI work on this, which, small samples, there's not a whole lot of it, but there's kind of these two hypotheses about retrieval errors and integration errors. And so when you put people in the scanner and you give them this, so this is kind of local sort of misinformation story is that, oh, there was a fire in a warehouse and the cause was oil and paint gas cans that were stuck in the closet and lots of smoke and so on. And then one group gets a correction saying, actually the cause of the fire wasn't the oil and the paint cans because there were none in the closet. That was an error. And then later, when you ask people to make inferences, why was there smoke? They keep saying because of the oil and the paint gas cans. And so there's a continued influence of misinformation effect, which is problematic. And some people say that that's because when you're trying to access true and false information at the same time, people are not suppressing the misinformation. So that's a retrieval error, or people are not sort of linking the correction into their model and mental model of the myth. And so there's an integration error. I think the bottom line is the same though. The problem is that debunking works if it's simple, if it's coherent, if you provide people with an alternative. Just saying that something is false doesn't actually give your brain anything to go on in terms of what's true instead. So you just revert back to what the falsehood was. So you actually have to provide an alternative. If the alternative doesn't resonate with you politically, if it's too complex, people don't integrate it. So there's all of these sort of battles that you're fighting with debunking. And that's why we try to focus on this idea of pre-bunking or psychological inoculation, which tries to prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place. Now, okay, what is inoculation for the people who are not social psychologists? So inoculation follows the medical analogy almost exactly. So the idea is that just as you expose people to a weakened dose of a falsehood or a virus in this case, which triggers the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection. Turns out you can do the same with misinformation, right? Instead of a virus, you have misinformation as a pathogen. And what happens is that when you expose people to a weakened dose of the misinformation or the techniques used to produce misinformation, and when you refute and deconstruct them in advance for people, people can build up psychological or cognitive antibodies so they become more resistant to it in the future. The psychological process has a few components. There's a forewarning, which is meant to elicit sort of motivational threat, kind of jumpstarting the immune system. Most of the time it's sleeping because we're not actively monitoring threats to our belief systems. And so the idea is that, you need to be warned that you might be misled to get a more central mode of processing. And then you get the pre-bunk. So we later renamed this pre-bunking because it's easier for people to understand. And in the real world, if you're vaccine hesitant, the term inoculation might not resonate with you. So that's why we kind of, went with pre-bunking. In the literature is also called a reputational preemption. So you preemptively refute the future falsehood, and then people build up resistance to it when they're exposed to the full dose. And that's really the logic. And of course, the key logic is the same. Your brain needs lots of examples, microdoses of manipulation in order to be able to recognize and neutralize deception. And so that's really the core of it. And then we've got lots of interesting headlines when we did some laboratory research on this. Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. It's possible to vaccinate Americans specifically, of course, because they need the vaccine, perhaps more so now than ever. And so the idea is that people come into the lab, you give them the pre-bunk, you later expose them to misinformation. Turns out they become more resistant, less likely to believe the misinformation, right? So we've done lots of those type of lab studies. Which I won't have time to show you here, but then we got questions about, okay, but how would you scale this in the real world? People are not going to come to the lab and read a 600-word essay and get pre-bunk and internalize it, and then you're going to test them, right? So how could this inoculation theory, how could this really be implemented? And so we took some inspiration from the dark arts. At the time it was all less controversial, I should say that. The Harry Potter novels. This is more of my odes to Alan Rickman than anything else, but I was fascinated. Of course, I guess I saw today the original site at Oxford for some of the movies, so perhaps good spot here to talk about Defense Against the Dark Arts. Snape said your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And I think that really resonated with me insofar as sort of, need to check the facts, give people the facts. That's kind of that's important, but there's nothing creative about that, right? We have AI, deepfakes, it's all evolving pretty fast, and our responses aren't. And so that's what kind of motivated our thinking about how can we make this interesting, fun, and engaging for people. And in these dark arts classes, you actually get exposed to some pretty threatening stuff. In order to be able to defeat it. And that was there's an analogy with experiential learning there that I really liked. And so that led to the creation of a game called Bad News. This was the first fake news game at the time, a couple years old now, more than a couple years, I would say. And this is a simulated experience. And it started out as a simulation to expose people to weakened doses of the techniques that are used to manipulate people online with misinformation. We did a couple years of research on what those techniques are, interviewed people in Russian troll forums, looked at government documents. Of course, by no means these are all the techniques, but these were some of the key ones. And then you're exposed to weakened doses of these techniques, and you go through this sort of internal process of trying to resist them by actually making use of them in a controlled, simulated environment. So everything's fictional, of course, so they don't accidentally infect people. Bad News is a pun. So the goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing any credibility by making use in controlled, weakened form some of the manipulation techniques that are used on you on the internet. So here we have Donald Trump. This is an old one. So we've just updated it. Maybe this is a little too soon, but here we go. I'm back. So great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. #U.annex. And the idea here is that you're impersonating Donald Trump. And as you can see here, the Twitter handle is manipulated. Most people actually don't catch this trick on the pre-test, but then once people go through the inoculation module, they're more likely to spot it on the post-test with different examples, of course. It's also weakened with humor and sarcasm. When we started doing this, it was a very kind of non-judgmental approach. We have, you can make fun of the left, the right, governments, big corporations. Now, of course, given the current circumstances, we have to update it a little bit. Mainstream media is one massive conspiracy, #fake news. Of course, we all know that. You start trending, creating your own hashtag. So today we added Elon Good News. I just bought Fox News, and their primetime shows are now home videos of me playing tennis in my bathing suit. #self-improvement. You're impersonating NASA, huge space objects that have hit the US West Coast. It's interactive, right? So people respond to you, they're liking your stuff, they're sharing it. So you get the outrage experience and what it's like to be duped online. So here's some of the techniques: polarization, right? Creating us versus them mentalities through headlines, impersonating doctors, politicians, organizations, floating your own conspiracy theory, trolling people during elections, using emotional manipulation, divisive language, and discrediting official institutions and accounts by using, casting doubt on science and engaging in denial tactics. So these are some of the 6 techniques. Raccoon actually came up with the acronym DEPICT, so people could remember them. Some of this stuff is more subtle, right? So here's an example of the appeal to emotion fallacy that we use, right? So apparently I was ruining the planet, keeping my baby warm. And so the idea is that you use some totally unrelated example to cast doubt about climate change, because, we all need energy to keep our babies warm, so why care about climate change? For some of the conspiratorial scenarios, we relied on publications where we looked at conspiracy language. This is the language used by some of the top conspiracists on Twitter, right? They use a lot of anger and anxiety, and that's adopted by their followers, and they're more likely to talk about power and death and religion and these type of themes. And so that served as inspiration for some of these modules. Juice boxes are laced with LSD to keep us subdued. Schools no longer teach cursive, so kids can't read the Communist Manifesto. You start floating that, but they say, okay, what a stupid story. I just drank a sip of juice and guess what? Still not hallucinating, #idiots. And so this is actually giving feedback that that's not what a clever manipulator would do, because a conspiracy theory can't really be debunked. And so that's how they work. That's the psychology of it, because otherwise people would be debunking it immediately. And so they tend to sort of leverage this uncertainty about current events. And so on. You draw your own missing airliner conspiracy here. And as we graduate, you move up. And so it's all fictional, but based on reality to keep the ecological validity. So somebody faked a Warren Buffett account on Twitter. You can see here, same trick, the T is missing with the Twitter handle, hundreds of thousands of followers in minutes, and this account was pretty nonsense, like, invest in what makes you happy. But the examples are taken from the real world, but they're all fictional. And so here's John Rosenbeek, who really was the mind behind the Bad News game and is responsible for much of the humor. So if you don't like it, complain to John. No, but John's Dutch, so am I. But we have to moderate some of this humor for an international audience. But other than that, John's also produced a lot of the important science behind these games. So what do we do? So in this game went viral organically, right? It was a science project that was kind of went viral. And so we just had a simple pre-post experiment, very simple, right? So on the items that were credible, don't use manipulation, people found them reliable before or after playing. But for the items that use the manipulation techniques that people were inoculated against in the game, people found them less reliable after playing. Here's the violent plots. Didn't really matter if you were left-wing, right-wing, young, old, lower, higher educated. People start out at different levels in terms of their susceptibility, but the intervention effect was about the same. Now, of course, you can immediately see that the density here is very low on the low end. So, these are people that opt into a game, so they're not that susceptible anyway. It seems, people interested in learning about fake news. So we decided to do some randomized controlled trials too. Melissa, one of our students, all of our papers are puns. Good news about bad news. We also have to study bad news about bad news, so don't worry, we even out. But there were lots of issues with this, right? It wasn't randomized, wasn't controlled. Maybe there was just too little, the game slows down a lot when you have a lot of items, because it's a real world, intervention. So it takes up a lot of cloud space. And so one of the things that we created was a plugin. So we could do an Infaltrix and add many more items. So we had 18 items, 3 for each techniques, 6 techniques, so we get some basic reliability. And then a control group who plays Tetris for 20 minutes. And I remember getting these messages from people asking if they're really getting paid to play Tetris for 20 minutes. But yes, if you're in the control group, that's what's happening. And so you can see here, control group, nothing's going on. Average improvement of 0, pre-post, these are all mixed experiments, mixed design. Inoculation, people find on average misinformation less reliable, density shifting to the left, which means less reliable. Melissa also had this interesting hypothesis that if people are not very confident in their own abilities, they might be easily persuaded. And so we also felt that the game actually improves people's confidence in their own truth discernment or manipulation detection abilities. So this was all good and well. And then Raccoon came along and said, but how long does this actually last? Because if it only lasts, 20 seconds or a day, then how useful is it really? We should be looking systematically at the long-term effectiveness of these inoculation experiments, and then that became Raccoon's whole PhD project, which led to many interesting insights. Some of which I'll feature here. There we go. Hope that picture's still up to date. Looks pretty good. I'd say looks pretty good. So same design, treatment control, right? So I'll explain it once because all of our studies are similar. So you get this pretest, these quiz of 18 items, right? Then you can randomize the inoculation or control, and then you get attacked every week with misinformation. It's called the attack in the inoculation literature. It's a bit sinister, but basically this means that we ask people, we prompt them with misinformation and see how resistant they are after getting the initial vaccine, week after week after week for a period of 3 months. Second experiment, exact same thing. We just follow up with people at the end. And then the third one, we changed the items of the testing periods because the reviewers were like, I want people just remembering the items. I remember thinking I barely remember what I had for dinner last night, but let's assume people are remembering 18 items at every stage. So just to build that out. So as you can see here, there's a treatment control difference, but it persisted for the whole testing period. I remember Raccoon and I thinking that's great if that was true. That seems like, it's a little too good to be true. The other thing is that if the whole PhD is supposed to be about the decay of this effect, then it's a little problematic if there's no decay of the inoculation effect. But luckily in the second experiment, well, I'm not sure, luckily for the research, we did find some decay. So you can see here that there was still a treatment control effect at the end of the testing period, but misinformation, people found misinformation more reliable again, which is interesting because this decay is about 40 to 50% of the effect. And so what we started thinking was that actually maybe by engaging people at every period, we were boosting them in a sense. And Raccoon's PhD later sorted this out in much greater detail. Seem to have lost one slide here. Maybe I'll come back to it. And in fact, we have a publication that's forthcoming in Nature Communications too, where Raccoon looked at different ways of inoculating using videos, games, text over long periods of time, and then the mechanisms that actually explain why inoculation is effective and why it loses effectiveness over time. And two of the competing kind of mechanisms here are memory. So, a lot of the cognitive scientists say, this is a memory problem, people just forget. But then a lot of the social psychologists are like, this is a motivation problem, right? So people need to be motivated and people lose motivation over time. And so, we could kind of combine these two explanations. And I think broadly, what we found is that memory is a leading explanation, is that, memory measures, both subjective and objective, seem to predict the decay of the intervention. It does decay pretty exponentially over time in terms of forgetting curve. And we also tried to boost people, and the memory booster was effective in preserving most of the effect, whereas the motivational booster didn't have any effect. But motivation did seem to have an indirect effect on memory. It kind of makes sense, right? That if you're not motivated, maybe you're less likely to remember things. And so this memory motivation model of inoculation was kind of a core message of Raccoon's PhD. Did I summarize that accurately, more or less? But not spreading any misinformation. Okay. So a few more things. People came to us and said, okay, great, but what about social cues? Maybe if you go online and lots of other people that you identify with are sharing it. So maybe even when you're inoculated, that's great, but maybe if you see social cues, you're still going to share it. And so Cecile, we designed this experiment where we actually varied the source for the US audience to be either in-group or out-group. So that you can see the uber creepy tracking your every move. That's a conspiracy theory. And we varied the source identity. So either Fox News or CNN, but the content would be the same. Right. And so it's in-group, out-group for liberals, conservatives in the US with a bad news game. And then basically what you see at the pretest, which is interesting, is that, people are more likely to believe misinformation if it was in the in-group, so congruent with self-reported ideology, than it is out-group or control. Then some reviewers were like, okay, but you classified that. What about people's perception of the slant? So if you look at people's own perceptions, you basically see the same effect. Even for people who said that these headlines don't have any slant, which is kind of interesting. And then post the inoculation intervention, you actually see that the inoculation kind of still works, regardless of whether it was in-group or out-group versus control. And so it's interesting. The effect size is lower though. The effect is bigger for the control than it is for the social group. So social cues do seem to lower the effect size of the inoculation intervention, but they don't eliminate it. And so there was still positive discernment between credible and misinformation after the experiment. So after we did all of this research, the UK government was interested in helping us translate this intervention to different audiences around the world, and so they helped do large cross-cultural translations of bad news. We now have it in pretty much every major language around the world, so we could do cross-cultural research. People have done independent replications in other countries like India, which is very interesting. So this replicated bad news game in India, pretty much finding the same thing as we found in the UK. In the UK, we didn't find that the game helped people discern real news better, because that's not the purpose of the intervention, but they did find that in the India study, which is kind of a happy accident, I suppose. There's been meta-analyses of this literature, on how, inoculation helps people discern between manipulative and credible information. We've looked at feedback, just with the immune system. There's so many interesting ways, next to boosters, right? There's lots of ways in which you can extend the immunization analogy. Is that the immune system learns from feedback, right? Which invaders are the bad ones and which are the healthy cells. And so you might wonder that if you're like in a 20-minute simulation that goes on about manipulation, you might come out a little heavy on the perceiving manipulation. And so some people said, well, okay, maybe we make people too skeptical about news media. And so we said, well, maybe that's a good thing. But let's say for people who think that maybe that's not a good thing, maybe we can calibrate it a little bit more. And so we have this feedback module in the games. This is for a WhatsApp game, but it's the same in the bad news game. Where we quiz people and then say, if you have a response pattern, right, that's just kind of skeptical, say that's just a normal headline, man, pay attention. And so, this headline overrides your sense of accuracy. This is about the emotional fallacy. And so we give people a little bit of feedback on how they're doing, which seems to calibrate people's responses a lot. So for example, if you look at this is signal detection theory, I'm not sure how familiar people are with it, but basically, you have correct hits, people giving the correct answer when it is the correct answer, and then false positives, right? Some people say it's manipulation, but it's not manipulation. You can plot these things out, and you can see that the feedback helps improve the signal detection sort of exercise of D prime, which is the discrimination parameter, or here it's actually the AUC, the area under the curve. And so people become more discerning with feedback than without feedback, which is really interesting. We have one for kids. We did one with the government during the pandemic, go viral, much shorter, 5 minutes, because it had to be skilled in social media. We can't just be a science experiment. Focus on fake doctors peddling fake cures and conspiracies about getting microchips and stuff like that. We were lucky to be part of the UN and the World Health Organization's Stop the Spread campaign, which kind of blew up this intervention. It actually became one of the most visited pages on the WHO page. And this go viral. They don't have a sense of humor at the WHO. So we wanted to call this game Unmasked. Because we thought, all the people who don't trust the WHO are going to be amused by that. But they said, no, we have to show how misinformation goes viral on the internet. And so, we have to keep it factual, but it's the same as bad news. And, you join a group called Not Go Afraid, and you find out that eating kiwis actually cures the virus. And so, a lot of it is similar, but it's based on direct messaging. We did parallel trials in Germany, UK, France, and basically found similar effects. It actually worked a little better than the UN's infographic campaign, which is kind of a passive pre-bunk. So actively being involved in the game does seem to do something. So we found that actually people have higher motivational threat, which is the idea that you're more motivated to address a attitudinal threat than people who are in the passive conditions. And you're also more likely to share the inoculation game than some of the other interventions. We did one during the previous election. With Chris Krebs, who was fired by Trump after he kept debunking Trump's election fraud claims. So it was based on the pineapple pizza metaphor, which is that, you take an issue. This was to break down the process of foreign interference for Americans. And so we created this inoculation with with CISA, which is in charge of the election integrity in the US. And so basically, you take an issue like, should you put pineapple on pizza? Then you say, oh no, the Italians, they're going to be offended. Do we have any Italians here? Yeah, true. That's cultural appropriation, very bad. And then you have the people on the other side saying, no, don't restrict my pizza topping freedom. I'll put it on my pizza, whatever I want. And then you buy bots to blow up the debate and disrupt society. And, of course, they didn't do that on pineapple pizza. It's about race and abortion and all these sort of issues. And so there's an election caster, so you can see how your misinformation is affecting the election. And then we test people with some real polarizing stuff from social media. See if people can recognize it. And basically we find the same thing. These are the data points, these are the medians. So, people find it less reliable, they're more confident and less willing to share it with other people. And we didn't do it this election because of, political reasons. And to some extent, there was more domestic misinformation in the US than foreign disinformation this time. We extended this to radical violent extremism. Whenever there's a playbook that you can break down, that's a really good candidate for inoculation. So extremist organizations, both right wing here in the UK and in Europe, but also groups in the Middle East, they sort of share this playbook. Identify people who are vulnerable, maybe going into a transition in life, kicked out of school, unemployed, gain their trust, isolate them from their friends and family, and activate them to do something bad. And you can simulate that. So we have simulated WhatsApp conversations. I understand loyalty is important, but you need to come join our group. And so, you shouldn't trust your friends and family, really, we're your real friends. And so this is kind of how that goes. And then actually we went to areas in Iraq that were formerly occupied by ISIS and had students there go through this event and actually found that, it helps them identify attempts to manipulate them into recruitment. And the last thing I'll talk about is some collaborations with Google. Google said, funny scientists playing around with their games. And they said, we like the inoculation stuff, we like what you do, but you have this opt-in problem, right? That in the real world, people have to opt into this intervention. And so the people who are spreading the most misinformation, you're maybe not reaching. The WHO can target them with Facebook, of course, but it's not the same. So we own YouTube, right? And one of the things that they proposed was we could do little videos. And you can put those in the ad spaces. You know, those annoying ads on YouTube you can't skip. So we could put the free bunk in there and then scale it across billions of people and nobody can skip it. That was the original idea. And I thought that was a very cool idea. So we started this almost now, 7-year collaboration with Google. And so they really do get this approach. So we create these videos that follow a script, an inoculation script. You may be targeted on this platform. You should be aware. Here's a microdose of, or here's, an example of scapegoating minority groups, for example. And here's some more microdoses of how to spot this in the future. And, we published a study with 6 lab experiments, and then the reviewer said, okay, you've done so many lab experiments on this inoculation stuff. We really want to see if this works on social media, otherwise we're not publishing it. And so we took us a year to negotiate with Google to have YouTube, because YouTube doesn't work with outside scientists, to have them actually do this for real. So we were able to actually do this on YouTube with about 1 million people, and they allowed us to sample 30% at random. Half got a control video, half got one of our inoculation videos, and then we displayed them in the ad space. And of course, the videos had to be so weakened that there's no risk of infecting people. They wanted like a modern COVID vaccine completely inactivated. So we can't talk about abortion, about climate change. And so John Rosenbeek, and his sense of humor saved us because he has a lot of knowledge about pop culture from the 90s. And so we went back to Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith, for example, to explain the false dilemma technique. So YouTube's different from regular news, right? They're radicalized on YouTube, gurus that try to prey on young men, and they use a lot of manipulation techniques. And one of them is the false dilemma, which is, present 2 options, while there's much more nuance, right? To take away all the nuance and you breed extremism. Politicians often use this technique too. But what did we can those be? So we found this clip from Revenge of the Sith, where Obi-Wan is talking to Anakin Skywalker, who goes on to become Darth Vader, spoiler alert. And so, he goes like, I'm not actually going to do the voice. But he basically said, you're with me or you're my enemy, right? And Obi-Wan says only the Sith deals in absolutes. And then the narrator goes like, oh, don't join the dark side, right? Don't use these manipulation techniques. So that's the we can do. Scapegoating, we use South Park, blame it on the Canadians because, it's always the Canadians. And so this is something that in the US resonates with partisans on both sides because it's non-political, right? And so we do test people with actual examples. Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? We should be helping the homeless instead, and so on. And then we quiz people, and it wasn't direct. There was a 24-hour delay on average between seeing the video and getting the test in the ad space. So we hijacked that ad space that's usually used for brands and brand memory for actually scientific research, which was a new sort of thing. So you get the lab experiment. So you can see that discernment, which is in red, goes up for the techniques after watching the videos for all these different types of videos. Sharing goes down, people find it less trustworthy. And then the effect sizes are quite big for the lab, right? And then you go to the field, and then we have about 5%, 5 to 10% boost. People are on social media, on YouTube, distracted, right? So that's a big drop off in terms of the effect. But then we learned that companies pay millions for like a 1% boost in brand name recognition. 1%. Because they know that it affects sales in a certain way. So YouTube thought like 5 to 10% for one-off ad campaigns actually big. And so they've continued to roll this out. Google now does it on their own. They did a huge campaign in Germany where they reach over half of the online population with these type of videos. They did it during the EU elections. They failed on their promise to implement this in a mandatory way in YouTube and integrate it systematically. And Google's pushing this, but YouTube is not making it mandatory because of concerns about, we can't force people to watch an educational video. Ooh, but you can't force people to watch a corporate ad though, because that pays money. And so we had a handbook for NATO during the war. Biden actually used it against Putin's invasion. We worked with the State Department at the time to pre-bunk the invasion. And so Putin had to find a new pretext, which was a cool application of a social psychological intervention. It's been written into the DSA now, pre-bunking, people interested. We're trying to do lots of theoretical models now of how this works in terms of herd immunity. So we're trying to simulate populations and inoculating them and misinformation spread and network dynamics and see how far you can go. One of the things we're looking at is the SIR model from epidemiology. These are just 3 differential equations that kind of describe the susceptible, disinformed, and recovered nodes of a basic epidemiological model. And so, you can see that debunking at the real world effect sizes don't do enough to stem the spread of disinformation. But if you combine debunking with heavy pre-bunking, then you can actually contain the spread of this information. But it requires that it's heavily preemptive at a very large scale, which is not what's typically done. So we're continuing with that modeling. We've used AI to assist us now during the election with pre-voting. And if you want to read more of my propaganda, here's the book. And thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you very much, Sandra. We have time for questions. We'll start with any ECR. Questions from ECRs. Is there any in the room? Yes.
I was wondering when you looked into the stuff that was also how different countries maybe reacted during COVID and you had a look at how governments approached it and kind of said what their guidelines were maybe strict versus more relaxed and how that affected people and how maybe slowly they reacted to this.
That's a good question. We have not, but it is interesting because different countries had very different approaches. So, our approach to doing the pre-bunking is always very indirect because we know that people have reactants when they're told that their freedoms are being restricted, and so they're less likely to want to participate. So that's why we always try to use humor and keep it, open and non-political. And that's why we like when we work with official organizations for them to adopt the same approach, but it's a real challenge because they're official organizations, so they just want to relay facts and they don't want to take any risks. So it's sometimes hard to systematically study how to do things. The EU did an interesting study where they did the EU label on the pre-bunks or not, and found that, it didn't diminish the effectiveness as much in the EU because people trust the EU mostly. But it's an interesting question. I think in countries or areas where there's very different government approaches, people have very different attitudes towards official institutions, you could probably get a moderation effect where, some people are more inclined to look at this. There's been some research on how people organically engage with pre-bunks, and there's kind of a medium inclination to engage with it on a voluntary basis, and there's some differences that people higher in trust are more likely to engage and people lower in trust. So the question is, how can you design these things to appeal to different groups? And that's a big challenge. In India, we're doing some field work where we try to use local comedians and influencers that people trust, or religious leaders, for example. But yeah, it's a good question.
Any other ECR questions? We'll open up for more general questions.
To what extent this relates to being cons on social media more generally, the sort, or by email, the sort of the more obvious extreme Nigerian prince scams, and sometimes rather more subtle ones that can put more people in. I'm wondering if there's any relationship between being conned on those sorts of scams and fake news stuff, and whether there's room for any inoculation again.
Absolutely, it's a great question. So in general, the more people get their news from social media, the more susceptible they are to misinformation, because we know that headlines from social media are much less accurate than from legacy media and other sources. So another though is with the scams, there is a common sort of gullibility factor that people lower in analytical thinking, or people are more intuitive, or more likely to less likely to be open-minded, are more susceptible to both misinformation and these type of scams. Whether inoculation applies, so we're actually working with the Met Police on thinking about how inoculation could be applied to scams, because that is one of the areas where you do have a clear playbook. There's always some prince that is going to offer you money, and there's a structure to how they do that. And so we're thinking that actually you could break down this pretty well. You could actually simulate these types of phishing attacks on people too, which could serve as the inoculation. So Google's done something like this where they put people in a module and sort of, that you get messages of people phishing for your personal information in order to get a reward, but in an inoculation type of way. So absolutely. So I think there's a very close parallel to those type of scams and misinformation. And there's a lot of work that can be done on that nexus.
Yeah.
Could you vaccinate people against other types of biases like confirmation bias, for example?
Yeah, that's a great one. We've done the confirmation bias one in one of the, in an infographic one. And it worked, but I forget now. I think the effect size was lower, because I think, one of the hardest things also in the module is that, we can track how people engage with the content. It's very resource consuming, but we can see what people click on, obviously, and then tie it to their self-reported ideology. So for example, you might think that if somebody is on the left end of the spectrum, they're going to be more likely to make fun of the right in the game or something like that. And there's some mixed evidence, but I think in general, people struggle more with the polarization module, because in the abstract, people get it, but then when you apply it to a highly personal example, the bias becomes, much more salient. So typically what we see is that there is some effect, but bias, inoculation does struggle in overcoming people's biases a little bit. So there's kind of a reduced effect. And so, yeah, we're trying to find ways in which to explain confirmation bias, political biases in a way that allows people to really inoculate themselves when you're being targeted with something that's congenial to what you believe. That's a tricky nexus. But yeah, we're definitely trying to work on that. It works a little bit, but not as good as some of the examples that are easier for people who wrap their heads around, for sure, yeah.
Here's the questions and here's some done.
How do you think about the individual psychology of accepting this information? Framework, do you think about what different factors you think about?
Yeah, so based on Raccoon's test, we've had lots of data on what predicts susceptibility to misinformation. And the things that are associated with it are, I think one of them, there are different factors. So some are not psychological. There's demographics, like being younger, actually, Gen Z tends to do worse on this test. But then older people actually share more misinformation, from which we know from other research, political misinformation specifically. So there's some interesting sort of traits. People spend more time on social media, right? In terms of the psychological variables, I think that some of the key predictors of being low on trust of official institutions, right? Low on trust of mainstream media, being high on paranoia, being low on this concept of actively open-minded thinking, which is interesting because actively open-minded thinking is actually a key predictor of susceptibility to misinformation, which is the ability to, keep multiple hypotheses in your head, be flexible with uncertainty, and not so open-minded that your brain falls out, but enough open-mindedness not to have a sort of cognitive rigidity, which is associated with extremism. That actually tends to be a major predictor in some of our studies in terms of why people are susceptible to misinformation. In terms of the psychological larger frameworks, though, people debate about this a lot. So there's a camp that says, the psychology that explains this is just that people want to be accurate. So there's accuracy motivation, but they're being distracted online. There's information overload. There's not enough cognitive resources, and this is a resource constraint problem. And people want to be accurate, but they're not, and nudging them to be accurate solves the problem. And then there's other people who say this is a deeply political situation where we have in-group, out-group biases, and what explains the spread of misinformation is that people want to adhere to the identity of their group and sort of spreading information in a way that's congenial to advancing their own narratives, and they're using intergroup. So social psychological theories to explain why people spread misinformation. And I think it's a little bit of both. And it depends on the domain. In the domain of politics, then identity becomes much more relevant to psychological thinking about why people do this. When it comes to, misperceptions about health, like does vitamin C actually cure the cold? People don't bring their political ideology to that question. And so there's, more of an inattention, inaccuracy, common sort of misperception type of framework that seems to explain it better. But I think both obviously play a role. There's pre-existing motivations that orient our perceptual systems, right, in the world, and determine how we process and selectively integrate information. Then there's our need to be accurate, right, and people's tendency to want to engage with content that they believe is accurate. And I think these motivations can be competing, and social media companies manipulate some of these motivations by providing the wrong incentives. For example, we learn. People have sort of applied, reinforcement learning paradigms to how people engage with social media, that you become used to being rewarded for extremist content. And so people learn that over time, so they keep producing more of it. And so the incentives are sometimes misaligned, I think. So it's a complicated question. I don't think there's sort of one theory that explains it all, but there's definitely various theories Whether it's, has to do with dual processing, accuracy, not accuracy, or motivated, cognition, I think they all fit to some extent. There's been some interesting work trying to combine the model into computational models. There's a lot of disagreement. I mean, some people are like, well, it's just an agent problem, right? People do update, and it makes sense because if you don't know that it's misinformation, if you think that it's accurate, right, then you're just doing a Bayesian sort of updating. But if it turns out to be false and you know about it, then you're more of a chaos agent, and you need a different model to explain why people are spreading it. And I think we have both of these models, and people disagree over which one is more prevalent. But I think that's because it depends on the type of misinformation in the domain. And I think by integrating these accounts, we get a little bit further than the sort of siloing, which is kind of often what you see. Sorry, that was a complicated, long answer. I'm not sure. It was really important.
I'm sorry that we have to end here because we're at